I'm Alex Gomez-Marin. I'm a theoretical physicist turned neuroscientist, and I'm the director of the Paris Center. Some of you may know Paris and be regular participants to our events. For those of you who are not, let me just say, the Paris Center is in this really special, beautiful place in Italy, in Tuscany. And there we run in-person conferences and events and residencies, and also online events, different series, intense series, thematic series, year-long series, and also these kind of Zoom events, community events on the occasion of a book published, or in this case, as you know, the 10-year anniversary of the banning of Rupert Sheldrake's TED Talk on the topic of his book, The Science Delusion. So it's really an honor to have Rupert with us today. Rupert is, well, literally, and that's a topic, but needs no introduction. But let me say, he's an English biologist who did work in plant science, and then also wrote, the very same year I was born, in 1981, he wrote this book, A New Kind of Science, and there he proposed this idea of morphic fields, and that work through morphic resonance, by which, well, extending the idea of memory to all nature, and also a hypothesis that would shake the scientific establishment. We won't talk about that, but he got this editorial in a prestigious journal asking, in a way, or questioning whether one should burn that book, as it was attacking the Church of Orthodox science. And so what we're gonna do today is we're gonna talk for about an hour, a little bit less, and then we'll open it up. So Rupert is kind enough to stay a bit longer. We'll open it up 25 minutes for Q&A and comments. So write your questions on the chat, and also perhaps you'll have a chance to ask them live later. And we're gonna divide this conversation, which is gonna be freely flowing, but more or less in 3 stages. One will be descriptive, and Rupert will give us the background as to what happened then 10 years ago. The second part will be retrospective, in the sense of, well, what has happened in these 10 years? And then the third part will be more speculative as to what still needs to happen for this change some of us are wishing and even working towards to happen. And without further introduction, let me just say hi to Rupert, and really thank you, Rupert, for agreeing to be in conversation with me today in front of this lovely audience.
It's always good to be with you, Alex. A real pleasure. So would you like me to give something of the story?
Yes.
Well, it started with a talk I gave in London in 2012 about my newly published book, The Science Delusion. And after the talk, 3 very personable young ladies came up to me and said, they were organizing a TEDx event, and would I speak at it? And I said to them, well, nothing personal about this, but the answer is no, because I don't like the TED organization. I don't like the way they get all their speakers to do everything for free, and they charge huge amounts of money for people to go to their conferences. They make about £20 million a year out of income from conferences for which the speakers are paid nothing. And I said, I think it's a really bad model. The content creators get nothing, the brand gets everything. I'm completely against it, and I'm not against you, but I'm just against their whole business model. And so they looked a bit dismayed and disappointed. And a week later, my younger son, Cosmo, came up to me. He was a student at Sussex University at the time. And he said, Daddy, he said, you know those girls that asked you to speak at the TEDx event they're organizing? He said, they're friends of mine at Sussex University, and they really, really want you to do it. And I'm going to be doing a thing on the same day. And if you do it, we'd be on the same platform on the same day. And I'd really like you to do it. So, and they really want you to do it. So please. So I said, oh, all right then. So I agreed to do it thanks to Cosmo's persuasion. And then the event took place, and it had 200 people. It was sold out. It was a small hall in East London. It was recorded, put online like other TED Talks. The title of the event was Challenging Existing Paradigms. And so I did exactly what it said on the tin. And I thought no more about it. And then exactly 10 years ago, I was traveling with my wife, Jill Peirce, in central India. We were in a remote part of Madhya Pradesh in the middle of India, staying at a small town called Maheshwar, a holy city on the river Narmada, with no internet connection, except we were staying in one of these crumbling palaces, and there was just one room in the palace where occasionally you could get a flickering connection. And I thought I hadn't had emails for several days, so I got a flickering connection, and a few emails came through, and they were messages from friends of mine said, "Don't let them get you down. We're on your side. You know, this is outrageous." I had no idea what they were talking about. And it wasn't until we got to, I think, Bombay, a few days later with proper internet connection, I realized that this whole discussion about banning my TED talk had been going on. And also Graham Hancock's talk from the same event. And Graham had been much more proactive than me in sort of publicizing this. I hadn't publicized it at all. I mean, I barely knew what was happening. And so by the time I got back to England, there'd been a huge controversy on the internet, debates raging all over the internet, dogmatic skeptics backing up the TED people, lots of other people really upset about it, and a severe reputational damage for the whole TED organization. And I got an email from the head of the TED organization called Chris Anderson, who lives in California, saying, could we have a talk on the telephone to discuss the problem? So I said, well, yes, fine. And I gave him my number, and he called me at an arranged time. And he then said, well, what can we do to help solve this problem together? And I said, well, actually, you've created the problem, not me. I said, I gave a talk for free, talking on exactly the title that I was supposed to talk on, following all your rules. And you've seen fit to try and censor it. So really, I think it's your problem, not mine. And then he said, yes, but it's becoming really difficult for us. And he said, well, what can we do? And I said, well, the first thing you can do is publish the refutation I wrote of your so-called science board's reasons for taking my talk down. And he said, well, we can't do that. And I said, why not? He said, because you show that they were wrong. And I said, well, isn't that what a refutation is? And he said, we can't publish that. It might upset the science board. And I said, well, they've upset me. And so he then said, oh, I have to talk to my committee about that, or my board. And I said, well, don't worry, because I'm going to publish it anyway. It's going out within the next couple of hours through my social media and website, if you don't publish it. So he agreed to publish it straight away. And I said, you could also reveal the names of the science board who've seen fit to have my talk banned. And he said, oh, we can't do that. And I said, why not? He said, because they're anonymous. So I said, well, why are they anonymous? He said, well, that's how they are. And I said, well, why can't you reveal their names? He said, well, we can't do that because people might attack them. And I said, well, they've attacked me. I said, isn't this a bit cowardly? And he said, well, no, it's just the way we work. And I said, well, for me, it feels like being in a darkened room with hooded inquisitors. And so anyway, we didn't get very far with this conversation, and he did publish my refutation. And I later learned he'd actually read my book and told somebody he really enjoyed it. So I think what happened is they panicked. The TED was attacked by a couple of militant materialists, Jerry Coyne and P.Z. Myers, who are both American bloggers, who are very, very militant materialists. And as usual with materialists, they didn't attack what I'd said directly. They didn't try and say it was wrong. They attacked TED for giving me a platform, and they said I should be cancelled. I'm very used to that. I've been cancelled quite a lot of times. And so their technique is to get people cancelled. So TED fell in with their pressure and cancelled it, and I think they regret it. I think they came to regret it bitterly, but they panicked, they'd rushed into doing this, and they couldn't back out of it after that. They also did the same with Graham Hancock. So that led to a huge controversy. And then because the TED Talks are on Creative Commons licenses, people copied the talk and put it up all over the internet. And so as a result of the controversy, when it was banned, it had had 35,000 views. And now, as a result of all this, it's had 7 or 8 million views. I don't know how many. Last time I looked, it was about 7 million. So I'm sure it's more by now. And now it's just been re-released in an animated version that's had over 700,000 views in a few weeks. So this runs and runs. So anyway, that's roughly what happened. And I was astonished that this happened. I had no idea it would happen. I thought nothing of it after I'd given the talk. The event went well, and I just thought this was just a talk. And yet it's turned out to be, possibly of all the things I've done, the thing that's been most watched and probably had the largest effect.
Yeah. Well, let me highlight here 3 aspects, and you can continue, we can continue wherever you want. One is an emotional aspect of yours. I know you, and people who've listened to you a few times, or even right now, may realize that there's no resentment in all of that, despite how hard it must have been throughout the years. So there's still a joy and a creativity in Rupert. And so it's not victim mode we're talking about here, or the mode you usually operate, and which you could. So that's one remark about the emotional aspect, and that thing can be helpful for other academics or other scientists who may be in this situation. Don't get bitter if you can. The second aspect I want to highlight is the sociological. Why is it so outrageous? I mean, you're not a provocateur as I understand it, but what you say provokes certain people, maybe certain people who are really noisy, and we think it's kind of the whole world or the establishment, but perhaps what you say provokes a few influential people that then can make phone calls to get you canceled. In that, you're also a pioneer, being canceled. And thirdly, so the emotional, the sociological, and then the scientific. What is it that you were saying and that you have been saying that's so revolutionary / outrageous for some scientists to even entertain? So it's 3 questions, 3 ways, but let's just go with whatever resonates better with you.
Well, I think that the fundamental problem, you see, is that what I'm really working for, what I've been working for years within science, is to try and move the sciences on, or help move them on. There are a lot of people involved in this movement, beyond dogmatic materialism. And the dogmas of mechanistic materialism have dominated the sciences since the late 19th century. It's basically a kind of Victorian worldview, a mechanistic materialist worldview. The universe is machine-like, made up of unconscious matter, totally purposeless. Evolution is purposeless. There's no mind or spirit or God out there. There's no spirits or beings. There's just consciousness. It exists only in human brains and maybe other animal brains. And it doesn't actually do anything. It's nothing but the activity of the brain. Well, this is the standard materialist worldview that was developed in the late 19th century based on mechanistic foundations from the 17th century and dogmatic materialist ideologies from the early 19th century. And this took over the sciences and became the dominant orthodoxy. I've seen this for many years as a restriction on scientific research and thinking, and I've been trying in various ways to go beyond it. The idea of morphic resonance, memory in nature, is one attempt. The idea of exploring the mind beyond the brain as manifested in psychic phenomena like telepathy and the sense of being stared at is another. And in a variety of ways, I've been trying to go beyond this narrow dogmatism. Now, this is very, very annoying to materialists because some of them are true believers. They've made science into a kind of religion, not just a religion, but a kind of fundamentalist religion, and are extremely offended at anything that throws into doubt their beliefs. And they're completely sure they're right. Their view is that science represents progress and reason and is the leading edge of humanity. Religion and belief in psychic phenomena is nothing but superstition that should be left back as part of the baggage of history, confined to the dustbin of history, as science with scientists in the vanguard marches forward into the sunlit uplands of progress and reason and so on. That's the general worldview. And so what some of them see me as is a kind of traitor to this scientific priesthood. The editor of Nature, the scientific journal, Sir John Maddox, who wrote the famous Book for Burning editorial, in another of his attacks on me, compared me to a lapsed Jesuit attacking the Church of Rome. All through, the metaphor was that science was like the Church of Rome and he was like the Pope. That's how he saw it, with scientists as the new priesthood. And I was a kind of traitor and a heretic. And that is what got him extremely angry. And a lot of other people like Jerry Coyne and P.Z. Myers get extremely angry about this. And one reason I don't feel particularly resentful is that they're not evil people. They're people who believe they're fighting for the truth. They see themselves as heroic people fighting for science and reason against the dark forces of superstition, what Sigmund Freud called the black mud of superstition threatening to engulf civilization. So they and members of these militant materialist and skeptic organizations see themselves as the good guys fighting. They don't see themselves as narrow, bigoted, etc. They unfortunately have this misleading self-image. And so one thing about not taking it too personally is that they really, they're fighting a battle, an intellectual battle. They're not evil people. They just have a narrow view, a narrow kind of fundamentalist view. And it's not really personal. It's many of them personally are not hostile. I mean, whenever I used to bump into Sir John Maddox at events in the Royal Society in London, he was perfectly amiable. When I meet some of these people who are my sworn public enemies in person, we have, rather joking conversations. We don't hiss and spit and have to be held back by people from attacking each other or seizing them by the throat or anything. I suppose that's partly because this is England and that's more how these disputes go here. The Americans are much more vicious. The American skeptics much more vicious and aggressive. The English ones are pretty aggressive too, but they're not personally aggressive. So the reason that people attack what I'm doing is precisely because it undermines this materialist worldview, which they've made into a kind of religious belief system. And the reason they attack me is because, I have a PhD, I was a fellow of Cambridge College, I was a research fellow of the Royal Society. With most people, they can simply put them down. If someone attacks any of these doctrines who's not a scientist, their response is, well, why didn't you learn something about science first? Go and do a degree, do a PhD. Then you might be qualified to say something about it. Well, I have done all those things, and they find that particularly maddening. This form of put down doesn't work. So that's one reason for the viciousness of the attacks, or the emotion in the attacks. So I think these are some of the reasons that I've been so thoroughly attacked. And it's not just me. I mean, anyone who there's lots of people who have more holistic views of science. I just happen to be in the front line more than most, partly because I don't feel I've got anything to lose. In a way, I've already lost what I could have had. When I was attacked by Maddox in his famous Book for Burning editorial, it was effectively an excommunication. And what it meant was that I could never get a job in a scientific institute again, or a grant from any normal funding agency. And he thought that would be the end of me, that I'd retreat with my tail between my legs and sort of undergo a legal conversion course and become a barrister or something. Um, 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 but that didn't happen. And luckily, I've found people who are willing to fund my research on a modest scale, and I've been able to continue as an independent scientist. It's not the way I would have chosen things, but it's how they've worked out. Unfortunately, it gives me an exceptional degree of freedom compared with people who depend on institutions for their salaries and for their grants, who are often feel unable to speak out because it would be too dangerous, and indeed it would be dangerous.
Yes, there's a lot in there, Rupert. Let me follow it like this. So you've proposed theoretical ideas, and you've also proposed ways to test them, which is rare because one could be a good theoretician and leave experiments to somebody else, or to say, well, I'll be developing methodologies to test some of those things. Then there's this conundrum, this kind of fish that eats its tail, which is, well, here's the theory. Question, do you have evidence? Well, here's evidence. It seems to work in practice. Well, but it cannot work in theory, right? And so we go back and forth in this loop. And then there's this other tension, which you just mentioned, which is the institutional science and the outsiders who try to, in a way, get in, but they're kept out of the walls of the citadel. And then there's very few people like you who can go in and out, and in a way the message can permeate those walls in and out, but that's not the majority of us. And also that keeps the enterprise going in the direction despite events like this one 10 years ago. So I want to ask you next, you published your first book in 1981. This controversy was 10 years ago. So you've had like 30 years of pushing for these new ideas, and then these last 10 years. And so what has changed? Because there can be this spike of outrage, popularity, controversy, but sometimes this heat just dissipates and we go back to normal mode. So how do you see things moving these 10 years? I don't know what happened to TED. I mean, I don't used to watch them anymore, and I used to do it all the time. A bit disappointed, right? No pun intended. But there are other things that have evolved, like psychedelics, perhaps. At the same time, institutions continue. So you see, there are things that are changing, others have not. I think you have a really great perspective to let us know how you see these last 10 years.
Well, I think that there's been a general opening up in our culture towards a more holistic view. There's been, I would say, that dogmatic, mechanistic materialism, old-style scientism, is on the retreat. I mean, the kind of militant, atheistic, scientistic people like Richard Dawkins, for example, who embodied very much that attitude, is not a big intellectual force anymore in Britain, I would say. I mean, here he was, 20 years ago, he was ranked as our #1 public intellectual. You know, he had a huge influence. Now I think most people see this as shrill, dogmatic, narrow, bigoted, which it is. So I think partly there's been a decline in militant atheism and its credibility, and militant atheism is almost always linked to dogmatic materialism in science. The two go together because materialism is inherently atheistic. I think there's been a big growth in people who are taking spiritual practices seriously. There are many people who would describe themselves as spiritual but not religious. And I think that number is growing tremendously, both in Europe and in North America. And this is also related to a great interest in consciousness studies. Within the sciences, one of the areas that has really opened up is the study of consciousness itself, partly through the study of spiritual practices like meditation and other spiritual practices. And this is the theme of one of my recent books, Science and Spiritual Practices. Partly through psychedelics and the fact that research on psychedelics has now become legal in some countries, including the United Kingdom. And that has meant that there's been much more writing about psychedelic experiences and many more people, I think, feeling they have permission to try psychedelics. And there are now legal psychedelic retreats in various countries, including the Netherlands and Brazil and Peru. And increasingly, we'll soon be seeing them in the United States, where magic mushrooms have been decriminalized in Oregon and Washington and some other states. So that's part of it. Also, increased interest in near-death experiences, end-of-life experiences, lucid dreaming. All these aspects of consciousness studies have become much more widespread. And none of these fit very well with the mechanistic materialist view that the mind is nothing but the activity of the brain and consciousness does nothing. So I think that's one thing that's changing the general culture and also opening up particular areas within science. But most of institutional science has carried on as before, because the whole institutional structure and the grant-giving structure and the career structure is basically designed to give incremental improvements along established lines. To become a scientist, you have to get a good degree, which means you have to learn the standard establishment kind of science well. Then you have to do a PhD where you're kind of an apprentice to an established scientist, and you soon learn what you can say and what you can't say. And most people rapidly learn that you can't discuss certain topics like psychic phenomena or morphic resonance, or at least in public. Then you have to be a postdoc, a low-paid job in someone else's lab for 3 years, then 3 years in another one. By the time you're 35, you've had to work under other people, fitting in and trying to please people, because only if you do that will you have the chance of getting a permanent position, and getting grants. So this means that it's very, very conservative, and anyone who has other ideas usually keeps them quiet because it would derail their career, because this is intensely competitive. So I think that's one reason for institutional science staying as limited as it is. Another is it's related to that, the funding. Now, the funding is the one thing that might change, because there are now a lot of very rich people and a lot of independent foundations that could, if they wanted, fund different kinds of science, and some are beginning to do that. And I think that will make a very big difference. But it would have to be in a way where people feel that they can have a career if they come out of the closet. There are lots and lots of scientists in the closet with holistic views, but who won't express them in public. And it's all right to get a grant for 2 or 3 years to do something really unconventional, but what happens after that? You may never get a job again unless there's some sustained source of funding and some sustained career path. So these are to do with institutional issues, to do with jobs, careers, ambition, etc., and sheer survival.
Yes.
However, within the sciences themselves, within the hardcore sciences, there have been several changes that I think are helping to open things up. And I discuss those in the new edition of my book, The Science Delusion, which came out in 2020, which is thoroughly updated throughout. And the main 3 areas in which it's updated is firstly in the study of inheritance, because in the 20th century, the only valid form of inheritance was genetics, and neo-Darwinian theory of evolution is all based on genetic mutations, random mutations, genetic inheritance. The inheritance of acquired characters, the Lamarckian inheritance, was the worst heresy in 20th century biology in the West. It was the orthodoxy in the Soviet Union, which is one reason that it became so heretical in the West. There was a political polarization as well as a scientific one. Well, since around the year 2000, Lamarckian inheritance, or epigenetic inheritance, is being rebranded epigenetic inheritance, and now it's mainstream, very exciting, and it's leading to whole new ways of thinking of evolution, the extended evolutionary synthesis, which is far broader than narrow dogmatic neo-Darwinism of the selfish gene type, which considers only genes. This takes into account the inheritance of acquired characters, epigenetic inheritance, cultural inheritance, and a whole range of other phenomena that influence evolution, much more inclusive, and actually, ironically, much closer to Charles Darwin himself, who was himself a kind of Lamarckian and believed in the inheritance of acquired characters. So the narrow form of evolutionary theory was a 20th century development called neo-Darwinism, precisely because it differed from Darwinism in its narrow focus on genes. So that's one change. The inheritance is broadening out, and morphic resonance, the idea of memory and nature, has many implications for inheritance. And the atmosphere is now much more favorable for understanding evolution in a way that could include morphic resonance. It's still heretical, but we're getting to a point where it's becoming within a stone's throw of morphic resonance, and some forms of epigenetic inheritance, I think, are examples of morphic resonance, although under a different name. So that's one area. Another area which you and I have discussed often, Alex, is memory, where the idea is that the traditional idea is all memories are stored as material traces in brains, either as modified nerve endings or phosphorylated proteins or even DNA or RNA molecules that are suitably modified. And attempts to find these memory traces have failed over and over and over again. And a flurry of activity about 10 years ago led to people claiming they'd at last found the engram, the memory trace. But now it turns out that memories are not localized within the brain in the way that the memory trace theory would require. They depend on vibratory patterns of activity that can shift from one part of the brain to another. A memory depends on a particular pattern of waves, and it can shift from one area to slightly different areas. Different cells are involved, different nerve cells. And as you know, this is called representational drift. Now, I think all of these changes in neuroscience show that memories are to do with vibratory patterns of activity, which of course is music to my ears, because morphic resonance is all about vibratory patterns of activity. And the third area, the main area that's changed, is the assumption within the sciences that science was uniquely objective, and that scientists, everyone else was subjective and based on private opinions and subjective distortions and cognitive biases and so forth. But science was uniquely objective based on peer review and on replicable results, independently replicable results. Well, around 2015, it turned out that most papers in many fields of science could not be replicated, even papers in highly prestigious journals. And this, as many people will recognize, is now known as the reproducibility crisis or the replicability crisis. In biomedicine, careful studies showed that about 80% of published papers couldn't be replicated. A large study in psychology showed about 60% couldn't be replicated. And similar studies in other branches of science have shown that the majority of papers in the top journals by prestigious researchers in top universities like Harvard and Cambridge cannot be replicated. Now, this is a very serious crisis because the supposed objectivity of science depended on the claim that it was all replicable. It turns out that no one bothered to replicate studies if they were from prestigious labs. Even if you did replicate them, you couldn't get them published because journal editors said that it wasn't original work. It was merely copying what had been done before. And the pressures on people to advance their careers within institutional science are based on the number of papers you publish and how much attention they get, how many citations they get. This encourages people to publish spectacular positive results. And when people publish only a fraction of their results, in many fields of science only 5 or 10% of their data are published, you can obviously select the ones that look best, and that's what people do, and leave the 90% or so that don't look very good. Now, selective reporting of data is rife, endemic, within the sciences, and I think is one of the main reasons for the reproducibility crisis. So this is now wide out in the open. Scientific journals discuss this all the time, and the arrogance that used to characterize scientists when talking about the superiority of science to all other ways of knowing has been noticeably dimmed. I mean, it's the first time I've ever seen a mood of humility within mainstream science. It was when the replication crisis broke out.
Yes, and I can understand why many people may say, well, you're throwing stones on your own roof. And I've been also told that. Then well, that's a saying we have in Spanish. I don't know if it works in English. You throw rocks on your own building. I tend to reply, well, it's because the ceiling is not quite fixed. So when there's a storm, hopefully it will just blow all out, right? But there's so many things to fix. And before I get into that, let me recapitulate on some of the actual scientific proposals of yours, because we're talking about philosophical, sociological, emotional, but you mentioned memory, you mentioned epigenetics. There's also the problem of the origin of form, which is where you started. It's not solved, to my opinion. And then the problem of perception, or the idea that when we perceive things, our minds are extended onto those things we perceive, which is something you call the extended mind, even before it became popular. And I could say with a wink, and hijacked by a vanilla version of the extended mind. So the mind is extended, but it's extended in this way that it can't really do much, right? So you've been, let me do it because you're maybe too humble. You've been pioneering these ideas, and then as time went by, it's not that they've been all of them confirmed, but it seems like science is moving into that direction, maybe slower than we would wish. Also methodologically, you've invented all sorts of ways to do science at the outskirts of, the church of science, by doing citizen science, science that's cheap, science that can be done by normal people, real world science before it became popular. And in a way, you've tried it all, from within, from without, expensive, cheap, in biology, in neuroscience. And then there's the replicability problem, as you were saying. So too many things to fix. So I want to now walk one step back and mention, you were talking about the culture pressure, but then institutions just holding to that. It felt to me like this membrane potential, right? When there's more ions accumulating here, and at some point there'll be a spike. And that also happens has happened between science and religion, or science and spirituality, because people don't want to talk about religion. Like there's been, both of them have been flirting, say, well, maybe we can just fit each other back and not keep these tight walls. And a third image, you mentioned the closet. I've recently named it Schrodinger's closet, because there's so many scientists and also lay people who believe and don't believe. On their daytime, when they're working as official scientists, they do the usual thing, but then they have these other experiences with their pets, with their families, with their friends, that challenge what they do. So we, and I'm going to say we, live in this closet, right? So in a way, all we're talking is, in my view, a call to come out of the closet and from within, so that scientists say, well, look, that's what I want to study. It feels very real to me. Why I've been given this privilege to investigate something that deeply, that I deeply care about. Why not study those things? That's from the science point of view, but also the culture can continue pressing. And as you know, I don't have a lot of hope or trust in the word new paradigm, because it's been used so many times and it feels like it never really happens. And yet, it's like the tension is growing and growing and growing. And at some point, perhaps the dam, to put another metaphor, just crumbles and there's this outflow from both directions. How do you see it?
Well, of course, I'd like to think that's what's going to happen. I've been thinking it's going to happen for 50 years, and it hasn't. That would be, it's a very attractive image. And I think I can imagine ways in which it could happen. In fact, I spent a lot of time trying to imagine ways in which it could happen. With psychic phenomena, for example, which are probably the most marginalized of all fields of scientific research because they so go against the materialist worldview. Simply piling up evidence doesn't change much. I mean, there's lots of evidence now for things like telephone telepathy, but it's simply ignored. People like Steven Pinker, Richard Dawkins, and other noted materialists simply ignore it because they say it's impossible, therefore the evidence must be flawed. There's no point wasting time looking at it. That's their attitude. They're sure they're right. And however much evidence you have, won't make the slightest difference. Now, what would really make a difference is if someone developed an app that tapped into the phenomenon of presentiment, which is one of the things that psychic researchers study, where people have a kind of pre-echo of an emotional response that's going to happen a few seconds in the future. This is something that Dean Radin and others have worked on. I think it would be possible to develop an app that would enable people to use this in successful day trading on the stock market, where you have to make decisions a few seconds in advance about the way things will go. And I've talked to successful day traders, and I'm pretty sure that the really successful ones are highly intuitive and are using these abilities. If you had an app where people could learn how to do this and make millions through day trading, then companies would start giving training courses and lots of people would be making lots of money. That's the kind of thing people would take seriously in the modern world. And it's something computers wouldn't be able to do, however great their artificial intelligence. That would make a difference. I think that if someone discovered morphic resonance effects within new materials, and materials science is one of the most innovative areas of physics, people are developing new materials that show properties like superconductivity, as in Bose-Einstein condensates. There are various rather strange forms of matter that are being studied at the moment, which have very unusual and surprising properties: superfluidity, superconductivity, carrying electric currents with no resistance whatever, and so on. They're making new materials that have never existed before in the universe, as far as we know. And if it turns out that some of these materials, when you do the same experiment over and over again, it happens faster and faster. If it turns out that morphic resonance is happening within these new materials, and if it could be applied in new forms of analog computing, for example, and become the kind of thing that Silicon Valley startups would be working on, and people would want to do PhDs on it, that would open the floodgates for morphic resonance research. That's just one example. So I can imagine things that would make a difference, but nearly all of them involve technical applications that would involve investment. Because fighting these arguments on purely intellectual grounds in the present climate of our culture, which is completely commercially oriented, isn't going to work. Fighting it out through trench warfare in seminar rooms has been tried by psychic researchers for decades now, and it doesn't work. It doesn't get you anywhere because the skeptics still just go into denial mode. Whereas if there are applications where venture capitalists can get interested, then the money will flow. And people within the business world, in my experience, are much, much more open-minded than people in the academic world. In the business world, you get credit for being original, being first, investing in something new. In the academic world, you get credit for chalking up publications in prestigious journals, getting more and more citations within well-established fields of inquiry, and essentially doing more of the same, carry on with business as usual. And professors hate being wrong, and so they're defenders of orthodoxy. Whereas within the world of venture capital and in the world of entrepreneurial activity, there's an incentive to do things differently, to try and do something new. And that's why I think that the changes will probably come most rapidly. The floodgates will open most rapidly if there's some commercial application that would attract investors.
Yes, indeed. Some of our friends from the scientific and medical network say, well, this is a question of politics of knowledge and what knowledge counts and why. And you're, as I was saying, you're trying and have tried all different ways. So one is the one you just mentioned, also making it viral. And yet, let me ask you, and it's a bit rhetorical, but I also want to hear it again, maybe. At the same time, you and I and others are still writing papers and submitting them to journals. So you, Rupert, you haven't given up on official science. And that's very interesting to me, because after 40 years, you could say, F it, you know, like I'll just continue from the outside, but nevertheless, we'll still engage. Why?
Because, in fact, the people who are actually doing the research are within official institutions. It's very hard nowadays to do research outside them. I mean, I do some myself. But there's a limit to what you can do. I mean, I'm used to doing research under real life field conditions, partly because of my background. When I worked in an international agricultural institute in India, I was doing literal field research in fields. So I got used to doing research outside laboratories. That's normal in agriculture. It's not normal in most fields of biology or science. It's lab-based. If you work in agriculture, you have to plant your crops out in fields, in test plots, in replicated plots. You can't control the weather. You can't control the incidence of insect pests. You can't control it if the agricultural laborers go on strike, as they sometimes did during my experiments, and so on. So there's all sorts of factors. Agricultural research is inherently holistic and field-based. And so I learned to do research in a different way from the way most scientists do it, and in a way that's much cheaper, which was important because I've never been well funded. I've had some funding, but not much. Now, for doing more sophisticated experiments on new materials like Bose-Einstein condensates, or looking for epigenetic effects in fruit flies or nematode worms, you actually need controlled laboratory conditions. And it's very expensive to set up a lab. And so it's much better to do it within existing labs that are already there. And that means working within scientists who are already working within institutions. There are plenty of scientists, as we were discussing just now, within institutions who are quite open-minded, who are in the closet when it comes to their colleagues. They may entertain much wider thoughts than they express in public, in seminars in their department, and so on. And if they have an opportunity to do more wide-ranging research within their laboratories, some would welcome it. So from that point of view, I think it's very important to play science by the rules. I mean, I've always tried to play it by the rules. You know, when I first put forward the idea of morphic resonance, I put forward a hypothesis, I put forward evidence and suggested ways it could be tested. You know, I'm trying to play it by the rules. My opponents didn't play it by the rules. They just said, oh, this should be ignored, cancelled, etc. The book should be burned and so forth. So, but I think it's important to play it by the rules. And so I've published about 100 papers, more than 100 papers in peer-reviewed journals. I've got several in the press at the moment. And I'm writing several more in the next few months. And I think the reason this is important is because for things to be taken seriously within the sciences, they have to be within the scientific literature. And that means papers in peer-reviewed journals. And I believe in proper experiments and proper statistical analysis. And the peer review system, when it works properly, is really helpful. I mean, I've had some papers of mine I've submitted to journals. For example, I submitted a paper of 100 studies, videotaped studies on a dog that knew when its owner was coming home, showing a kind of telepathic behavior. I submitted that to the journal Animal Behavior, which is a leading journal in the field of animal behavior. And the editor wrote back saying, I'm rejecting your paper without refereeing because no referee for this journal would consider a paper that mentions the word telepathy. And probably he was right, and it saved a lot of time. So I appreciated the fact he was honest about it instead of pretending to consider it and then reject it on trivial grounds. But there are papers that do consider there are open-minded journals, and my experience in the last few years of peer review has been that this has been enormously helpful to have experts in the field critically review what one's written, point out there are papers that one should have cited, and I've had my attention drawn to references I didn't know about, and I was really glad to know about them, and pointing out different ways of doing a statistical analysis. This is very, very, very helpful, and it's all free. So I'm a great appreciator of peer review when it's done properly, constructively, rather than as a way of simply squashing things that people don't like. And so when it's done properly, it's really helpful. And I think that's an important part of normal science. So, I'm all in favor of the methods of science. What I'm against is the dogmas, which have come to dominate the sciences and the scientific institutions.
Yes. Now it's about to close, but I want still to bring two topics briefly. I don't want to leave without mentioning education, because we've talked about media and technology and culture, society writ large. Then we've talked about scientific institutions playing by the game, by the rules of the game, and scientists themselves. But I remember in some of our private conversations, the word education comes often, because and you often tell me, right, if we don't change the minds of what is taught from early on, then it's really, really hard to change the rest once it has grown into certain modes of thought and certain worldviews, right? So I would also like to hear your comments and your particular efforts to influence education, right? Because if that's already in the textbooks, well, that's in a way the gospel, and there is truth in it, but it also contains a particular worldview at the exclusion of other worldviews that perhaps those worldviews are the ones we badly need today.
Yes, well, again, there's a tremendous disjunction between institutional education and the wider culture. I mean, the wider culture includes PARI dialogues and the kind of things you're doing at the PARI Centre. It includes the talks that the Scientific and Medical Network lay on online and reach thousands of people cumulatively over the years, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. And there are blogs and there are social media in which ideas are shared and videos and so forth. And many people who are students in full-time education watch these YouTubes and listen to podcasts and get other ideas. But as soon as they go back to their regular course at school or at university, they're getting standard unreconstructed mechanistic materialism with all those standard 19th century assumptions as just the framework within which everything's taught. And they can't really challenge it, because then they won't pass their exams. And if they don't pass their exams, they won't get a good degree, and they won't become a scientist or anything else if they don't get a good degree. There's self-interest forces people to go along with this system. And then after a while, many of them just take it for granted. Why question it? If questioning it's just going to land you in trouble, and all you're really interested in is getting a job and enough money to do the things you want the money for, why bother causing trouble, and especially since it's futile. So I think this really is a huge challenge. How do we reform the educational system to bring these ideas in? There's very little going on at the moment in schools or universities that's offering an alternative perspective. Yes. There are alternative schools like Steiner schools, but if you want to get into a university, you then have to go through the standard exam system to go to a university. And even if you get a kind of alternative degree from, for example, Schumacher College in England, where I taught for many years in the holistic MSc course, there's just not much market for people with a holistic MSc, as MSc in holistic science. I mean, regular scientific and educational institutions don't have job descriptions of that kind. So I think this is an enormous challenge. And right now, there's a lot going on outside education, just as for practicing scientists, there's an awful lot they can learn about through YouTube and through discussions with friends and so on, and podcasts that goes way beyond the narrow limits of the science they're doing in their laboratory and their day job. But it's very, very hard to find a way in which they can influence each other. That's an unsolved challenge. And since I'm not working in an educational institution, there's not a lot I can do. I give talks whenever I can. When I'm asked to give talks to schools or universities, particularly to students, I prioritize those again over and above all other things, which I think, because I think they're the most important. I'm doing one shortly at the Cambridge Union Society, a student society, another to the Architectural Association students. I've given several in British secondary schools recently. But again, these are usually on the side in people's spare time and don't have much influence on the curriculum and the standard exams. So this is an unsolved problem, and I think we all need to think about how to do something about it.
Yes, and we're thinking about it, and I can also see signs of change, also solving the accreditation problem, maybe some academies that have relationship with universities, but also pursue this spirit of free inquiry. All right, last common thought offering to you. When we speak about worldviews and an alternative worldview, what would be a pity is that we go from one dictatorship, from one monoculture, to tear it down and erect another one, right? So my final thoughts are about pluralism. We're not asking here, at least that's how I'd like to put it, for people to now become Sheldrakeans and convert to morphic resonance or anything like that. We're asking people to entertain different ideas, test different hypotheses, and check different worldviews. And I think there's room for difference. It's not a winner takes all. Let's just tear this thing down and erect another one. Also in that process, there'll be some worldviews that will produce happier lives, more whole lives. So that's another thing to have in common. But at least I'm not trying to erect a new idol that now everybody needs to bow to. I think we're talking about this spirit where we can just see things and discuss them and disagree and still be in a community where this is possible.
Well, I think the best model at the moment for pluralism is within medicine, not official medicine, which is based on mechanistic materialism. But if you look at the wider picture, then here in Britain, I'm sure in Spain and everywhere else in Europe, there are acupuncturists, homeopaths, osteopaths, chiropractors, naturopaths, traditional Muslim medicine, Unani medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, yoga, and then spiritual practices like meditation, which have many spiritual practices have health-related effects, fasting, for example. So there are already all these practitioners of different systems side by side, and they're not within the official medical schools and the official system, but they do exist as viable presences within the wider community. And the movement of integrative medicine, which is an attempt to have a medical system that, instead of excluding everything that doesn't fit into a narrow dogma, includes anything that seems to work, and not necessarily saying how it works. I mean, if it works, then we'll include it. And one of the people here in Britain who's pioneered this is our now King Charles. I mean, he had the Prince's Institute for Integrative Medicine long before most people were thinking about these things, when he was Prince of Wales. And so I think that's one model. We've already got a functioning pluralism in our society, even though the alternative systems are deprived of state funds and support from official medical systems, they still are there. If they were supported, and if research on these other systems was encouraged, especially
don't let your girl go into enemy territory alone.
especially comparative effectiveness research, which looks at outcomes, what works, independent of the theory, then I think we could have an important move forwards in.
Let's see. Sorry about that.
About that, somebody keeps unmuting themselves. Sorry,
Yes.
continue, Rupert. Sorry about that.
Anyway, just to wrap this up, I think that the pluralism within science could be, that's one starting model. Another model would be to encourage different countries and traditions to do science in their own way. For example, in Brazil, there are already people doing research on spirit mediums, spirit possession as a curative, and can it actually lead to cures for mental illness? And apparently it can. In India, there could be a lot more research on yoga and traditional control of physiology by yogis that tell us something that Western medicine simply hasn't explored. How is it they control their metabolism in ways that we think impossible? In China, if they had more emphasis on traditional Chinese medicine and the underlying theories, we'd learn something new. Right now, there's a colonial mentality where in every country in the world, the scientists want to get their papers published in Nature and Science, and the brightest ones want to do postdocs at Cambridge and Harvard and so on. And so there's still a kind of colonial mentality. But I think decolonizing science could also help to bring about this pluralism and make science richer and more productive.
That's wonderful, Rupert. Thank you for mentioning medicine and also this last remark about a universal science that still can integrate indigenous ways of knowing and respect them. Wonderful. All right, well, let's close it here. Thank you again for accepting to be in conversation with me. Thank you for your work throughout these many years. I must confess it's a true honor to be a collaborator and a blessing to be your friend. Thank you very much, Rupert.
Well, a blessing for me too.
All right. So we'll open it up for question for another, let's say 20 minutes, and from both questions that may have appeared in the chat, and perhaps some people can also raise their hand, and Eleanor will take care of it, I suppose.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If you'd like to come in and ask a question, we ask you to use the raise your hand function. We do ask you to keep your questions very brief and to the point, as we do have quite a big group here today. So just out of respect for everybody that's here, if you could please try to keep your questions very focused. Vic, you had a question that you wrote in the chat. Would you like to come in and ask your question?
Sure thing. Thanks, Eleanor. Hi, everybody. Rupert, thoughts on correlations, if any, between morphic resonance and alchemical transformation?
Well, that's a really difficult question, Vic. I don't know, partly because I don't know exactly what alchemical transformation was about. There are a lot of alchemists in the 16th and 17th century were actually trying to make gold. The reason Sir Isaac Newton was appointed Master of the Mint in Britain after he retired from Cambridge was because he knew what was happening in continental alchemy, and central banks like the Royal Mint in England were worried that the market would be flooded with gold manufactured in Prague or somewhere like that if alchemists did what they said were going to do. But more recent accounts, like those of Jung and esoteric writings about alchemy, treat it as if it was all a kind of internal transformational process. And it wasn't anything as crude as trying to make gold and get rich quick. But actually, I think an awful lot of it was about trying to get rich quick through making gold. So it's very, very hard to know what was really going on. Morphic resonance would apply insofar as any process that they discovered would become easier if it were repeated. But since, as far as we know, they didn't achieve transmutation, that may not apply. And since the transformative process, the kind of psychological work, it's possible that some things they were doing are now have taken different forms under different names in spiritual practices, but I just don't know the historical roots enough to comment on that.
Good enough. Thank you.
Great to see you, Vic.
Thank you, Vic. Richard, would you like to come in, please, and ask your question? Richard, you're still muted. Would you like to come in and ask your question?
Yeah, is that better?
Perfect, thank you.
Yes. In 1996, at our hospital, we started a healing center, which of course got very little support from my colleagues, and even brought in amazing Randy to try to debunk what we were doing with healing touch. Even though I saw tremendous effects from healing touch at our center for several years, and I just wondered, could you comment on any studies? You know, of course, the problem is when you've got intentionality, but you have somebody else coming in to look at it that has the opposite intentionality, things don't work out. But I would just like to hear your comments on that.
Well, I think that it's a very complicated area. I myself have never done research in any healing modalities, partly because I'm not medically qualified, but partly because almost all medical research is very messy. I mean, even drug companies, totally orthodox drug companies, have to run large clinical trials to get any significant results because there's so much variation between people. I think underlying some of this research is what conventional medicine would dismiss as the placebo effect. But the point is, we don't really understand the placebo effect. It ought not to happen if mechanistic materialism is true, because consciousness isn't supposed to do anything. And yet people's beliefs and expectations can affect the healing process. So, you know, I just don't know whether if one says, well, therapeutic touch unleashes a placebo effect, that may be part of it. Part of it may be a direct linking of morphic fields. The field of the patient has a healing capacity. All morphogenetic fields in all organisms have a self-healing capacity. That's why organisms survive after injuries and diseases. They don't survive after all injuries and all diseases, but all organisms have a self-healing ability. Lower organisms, lower plants and animals, can often regenerate from small parts, like flatworms can be regenerated after they're cut up into lots of little pieces. Each piece can become a new worm. So there's this healing capacity that therapeutic touch or therapeutic whatever it's called, healing can encourage and unleash. And I don't think we understand quite how it's working. At the moment, as I say, it tends to be put under the rubric of the placebo effect, but the placebo effect may be a blanket term that covers several different aspects of healing. And, you know, I don't know the literature well enough to try and tease them apart. But it's also, of course, the case that if you have someone whose good intentions can unleash a positive placebo effect, then people who with bad intentions, like the amazing Randy, who wanted it to fail, could unleash an opposite of a placebo effect, which is known as the nocebo effect, a bit like voodoo death, you know, where if people believe they've been cursed by a voodoo practitioner, some of them actually die. That can be a very powerful effect too. And many people have commented on the way that doctors have to be very careful. You know, if they say, you've got terminal cancer and I give you 6 months to live, most people dutifully die at 6 months on. You know, that some people argue that's a form of voodoo death. So we're in an area that's very tricky and hard to deal with here, and obviously requires wisdom and discrimination. And I don't have personal experience of that, so I can't speak in more specific detail about it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming in. Chris, would you like to come in and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you so much. I was struck both by your comment about waiting 50 years for the shift to have happened, and also your comment about a commercial application. Do you see how venture capital could make an inroad into this? Have you had discussions with people? The reason I ask is I'm talking to people with money. And this is a very exciting possibility.
Well, I have actually, and I have a current series of talks, which are a series called 6 Potential Breakthroughs in the Sciences, which where I'm talking about potential breakthroughs that could make a real difference. The first one of the series is now online for free. It's on homing pigeons and migratory birds, a new approach to understanding homing and migration. Now, that particular one wouldn't have much in the way of potential application, because although homing pigeons can be very useful, they're not going to be the basis of $1 billion industry. But the second in the series is about a new approach to cancer. I've been working on cellular aging and cancer for 50 years. It's an area of my work that's not so well known, my work in cell biology. Then I have one about potential morphic resonance effects in improved learning and in material science, and which could be useful for venture capital. The idea I already mentioned of an app where you could learn to do day trading more profitably with short-term, cultivating short-term precognition or premonition. So within that series of 6 talks, which you can find on my website, I have various suggestions there, and I've been discussing them with a group of venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. So some of them are interested, but most of them still, venture capitalists still usually want things that are sort of 3 or 4 years from market, and some of these things are going to be further than that. One app that I could mention now, for example, if using Google Maps or something like that, someone developed an app where people could report on their mobile phone unusual animal behavior of the kind that happens before earthquakes, I think there could be a decentralized app-based earthquake warning systems, which could save huge amounts of lives, which would be perfectly feasible using existing technologies, and wouldn't be very difficult to make. Whether they'd make money is another matter, but as funded by a venture capitalist as a pro bono philanthropic thing, a way of preventing unnecessary deaths through earthquakes, using animal science, because animals often know several days in advance, they show unusual behavior. And right now, this is just occasional journalistic stories pop up about dogs howling before the earthquake, but within the scientific world, this is generally not taken seriously. There's now an institute in Germany that is beginning to look at this scientifically, but I think the best way would be simply to develop apps that anyone could use, and if large numbers of people in earthquake-prone areas were prepared to take part, I think an effective system could be developed quite fast.
And so through your talks online, you would have the network to put the money where it would best go?
Well, I don't personally have the net. I know various billionaires, and I do talk to them about things where their money could be well spent. I don't have an office where I sort of plan how the investments could go and stuff. I simply don't have the capacity to take on organizing hundreds of millions of dollars worth of research, recruiting people, setting it up. But I do have the ability to suggest these ideas to people who are in a position where they might be able to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for coming in. Thank you. Michael, will you come in?
Yes, certainly. Thank you for an absolutely fascinating discussion. Just a remark, one thing which strikes me is that the thing to which Alex and yourself both drew attention, which is the need for greatly increased kind of pluralism in the sciences. There's something very, very subject specific or topic specific about that. It's very noticeable that there are certain fields where there is already de facto much less of a monolithic view of the foundations of the subject, medicine being one example. in spite of the institutional split between what you might call some mainstream and alternative medicine. But there's a lot of alternative medicine being developed out there, and other areas of science where there's still a very monolithic view of foundations. One area which I think it's very striking, there is a striking, I'd say striking and increasing trend to disunity in the view of the foundations, is actually in the foundations of mathematics, which after all is the queen of the sciences, and which we're certainly going to need to develop any enhanced understanding of the way that physics has to alter to accommodate things like morphic resonance. And there, it strikes me as astonishing how in the last 50 years there's been a steady tendency towards an increasingly disunified view of the subject, which brings in many questions as to whether the point of entry into thinking about foundations comes from logic and semantics or from epistemology. I won't go into the issues, but the point is that one's seeing there a much more open-minded attitude, which is guided partly by the way that the evolving Zusammenhang of mathematics itself has gone, rather than an a priori bottom-up conviction that, you know, this is where the subject starts, its foundations have to start from here. And the same thing, it seems to me, in other areas, but the areas which are close to that, specifically that you mentioned, such as mainstream biology and molecular biology, are the ones which seem most resistant to being open-minded at all about any possible shift in the underlying foundational structure of the subject.
Well, that's interesting about maths. I wasn't aware of this in growing pluralism in mathematics.
It's a personal viewpoint, but
yes.
It struck me, it resonated, dare I say it, no pun intended, what you were saying there resonated very strongly with me, because that's my particular field of interest.
Oh, good. Well, I'm very glad to know that. I mean, it's true that some areas are more open than others. And for example, I don't know much about, I've never heard of an alternative school of chemistry, for example.
No, that would be a very good example of where there doesn't seem to be that kind of openness or
yes,
kind of disunity in underlying assumptions.
But within cosmology, it's quite interesting because the mainstream of cosmology and astronomy seem to have got stuck. Theoretical physics with string theory seems stuck. They seem stuck with, you know, untestable hypotheses like the multiverse,
yes.
Dark matter and dark energy, 95% of reality unknown to us. They're stuck.
Yeah,
but there is an alternative there. The electric universe theory is one, where there's a whole alternative school of thought already existing. And
indeed also, if I can just say very quickly, that's a subject of particular interest to me. I'm sure you're aware of Roger Penrose's cyclical conformal cosmology. Roger Penrose often speaks about the influence, dare I say it, the undesirable influence of the cosmology mafia, of the people who do indeed view that there's only one possible framework for discussing cosmology. And
one group of potential billionaire funders I discussed these things with had a very good approach. They said that, you know, within most branches of science, if you look, you can find alternative marginalized groups like the electric universe group for astronomy and cosmology. In psychology, you've got parapsychology. In medicine, you've got alternative medicine. And one way of bringing about a pluralism would be to look through each area of science and find where there's already existing alternative groups, which already have meetings, many of them electric universe people have conferences, websites, and so on. And they're all completely starved of funds, but putting funding into these already existing groups would increase the plurality without having to start from scratch. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. One could work with existing alternative groups and simply give some of them the oxygen of funding so that they could work more effectively than being continually marginalized and deprived of all sources of income.
Well, dare I say, that also resonates with me. And as they say, you're singing to the choir. Anyway, thank you very much indeed for the answer and indeed for your discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike.
If I may briefly, Michael, thank you very much for your comment on mathematics. And this helps me bring in another idea of Rupert, which perhaps is relevant to this, which is Rupert's idea, which of course can be found in other philosophers like Alfred North Whitehead, perhaps, that the laws of nature are more like habits. Now, if we had a mathematics that would allow, and I say jokingly, but I also mean it, that an equation could change itself, right? That we would not play this game of equation, dynamics, and then parameters that are somewhat externally fixed, then perhaps this could open up another way of just considering what living organisms are, like this logic of life. I don't think we should take this for granted. We don't even need to go to consciousness study, just organisms, what organisms do. And of course, mechanists or mechanicists, materialist reductionists, always like to straw man what they consider to be the only option as, oh, you're a vitalist. But there's a subtle way of being a vitalist, or even a way of being an organicist. And I think hardcore organicists like Robert
I
Rosen
couldn't agree more
others,
strongly. I don't want to monopolize any more of the question time, but of course that also resonates very strongly with me, because I've been very interested in the work of the late Robert Rosen, who the center of his work really was to underline the distinction between mechanisms and organisms as fundamentally distinct categories, and to see how far we might actually be able to find a way of mathematically characterizing in a deeper way where the distinction lies. And there's a whole literature out there.
And physicists needed new maths, curved space-time, and so on, to think through some phenomena, new maths for quantum mechanics, right? New formalisms. And so, of course,
that's an area that I'm also very interested in. So yeah, you're singing to the choir. There's lots to talk about here, which we'll do offline on Sutra, but
wonderful.
But thank you again very much for a very interesting discussion.
Thank you, Michael.
What would do you want to keep going with questions, or shall we close here?
I think we've got time for one more, haven't we?
Yeah. Okay. Hans, would you like to come in? You did write your question.
Yes, thank you. I'm a biochemist by training, and I'm working since 10 years as a strategy consultant for businesses around the globe. And I'm always involving the business people in discussions about materialistic worldviews. And you are all familiar with the concept of planetary overshoot, and we can see it with the biodiversity crisis and so forth. And so, my bottom line is, if people understood growth in a different way, in a non-materialistic way, that would be the avenue to really change the business model, which is self-destructive. We all know that. It's a power game and so forth. So Rupert, maybe you can comment about that and give me some support, mental and emotional support to carry on doing that, what I'm doing now.
Well, I think that one of the things that's most interesting about people in the business world that I've found is that when the official business discussions are about the bottom line and profits and corporate profits and all that kind of thing, but people's private lives are often quite different. And this became very striking to me when I had a friend who was a ruthless businessman. I was friendly with him in his off time because I was doing a homing pigeon experiment on his estate. I needed somewhere to keep the loft and a place to do this experiment with my pigeons, and he provided it. And when he was on his country estate, he turned it organic, he was preserving ancient oak trees, he was restoring hedgerows, he was cared deeply about the wildlife. But in his business life, he was ruthlessly competitive. Why was he so competitive? He wanted that money so he could fund his private estate. And why do most people want to get rich? At least in Britain, most of them want to get rich because they want to buy a house in the country and get away from it all. And the reason they want that is because they actually really like being in unspoiled nature and want to preserve it. So I think that one of the problems is to break down this split that we've created in our whole culture between the 9 to 5 Monday to Friday world of mechanistic materialism, which is the dominant orthodoxy in most people's lives, because it's the institutional orthodoxy of science, education, government, and business. And then the other more holistic approach, which operates in people's free time at weekends, as millions of people try to get back to nature in a car, clogging the great cities of the Western world on Friday afternoons and evenings. In their retirement fantasies, in their holiday fantasies, they want to go to unspoiled islands, and they don't want to go to places full of huge polluted buildings and polluted air. They want unspoiled palm-fringed beaches on isolated islands or something, the Maldives, if they can afford it, or something like that. So I think the real challenge is to somehow enable people to break down this compartmentalization that we exist within science, as we've been discussing this evening. There are many scientists who are not committed mechanistic materialists, although they pretend to be at work. And I'm sure this is part of the business world too. And it's a way of trying to come out of the closet. And we've created this split everywhere in the world. I mean, when I worked in India, I worked with Indian scientists, and when they were at work, they were completely conventional Western style geneticists, plant breeders, etc. As soon as they went home in the evening, most of them were completely conventional Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Parsis, or whatever. And they didn't see any conflict. They just had a dual life. And the same in Japan, you know, polluted cities, huge buildings, neon signs everywhere. And yet on Cherry Blossom Festival, they're sitting under cherry trees reciting haikus, you know, and relating to that traditional part of nature-loving Japanese culture. So I think that is one of the greatest challenges so it's not as if most people need converting from one worldview to another, because they already have the other worldview. It's a matter of somehow breaking down what's an impermeable barrier, so that this other worldview can seep into their working life, their day job.
Yeah, it's my experience too. Thank you very much, Rupert. I really enjoy that. It's very inspirational.
Do either of you have any closing remarks?
Well, I'm just gratitude again. And perhaps like your friend Terence McKenna, Rupert would say, find the others, right? And in a way, that's what we're doing, finding the others, to realize perhaps we're not so alone and we can work together, alone and together, towards that which we believe to be true.
Well, yes, I endorse that. I think that there are lots and lots of people who want these changes to happen, but they're mostly fragmented and isolated. And I know this is true because whenever I give talks in scientific institutions, I have the experience of people coming up after the talk. You know, usually the discussion, the public discussion, the Q&A is sort of fairly guarded and technical. You know, how did I do the statistics? You know, would this effect happen under these conditions, etc. But afterwards, during the tea break or the drink session, I have the experience over and over again. People come up to me and they look one way to make sure no one's listening. And then they say, I'm really interested in this, and my dog knows when I'm coming home from the lab, and I always know when my wife's on the phone, and you know, I'm interested in these holistic worldviews, and I've been reading this and that, and I've taken psychedelics, they've changed my life, and so on. But everyone else here is so straight. And then the next person who comes up looks both ways and tells almost the same things. So I say to them, you know, why don't you talk to your colleagues? And they say, there is no one else here who thinks like this. And I said, well, I know there are at least 4 or 5 people, because they've just told me. And I sometimes point them out. I say, why don't you guys get to know each other, come out of the closet? So I think this is something that can happen within institutions. And one example, although I'll end with just one example, the Royal College of Psychiatry here in Britain is the professional body for psychiatrists, and it has, I've forgotten how many thousand members, 8,000 members or something. And about 10 years ago, some of them formed a special interest group. Within these professional organizations, you can have special interest groups, and they formed a spirituality special interest group. And about 7 or 8 years ago, I was asked to go and speak to the spirituality special interest group of the Royal College of Psychiatrists on morphic resonance. And I expected to walk into a room with about 20 people, a small seminar room. And when they led me in, there was a lecture theatre with about 400 people in it. And I was amazed. And I spoke to the organizer afterwards, and he said, well, this is the most rapidly growing group within the organization. It has over 1,000 members. It's now more than that. And this gave people within the Royal College of Psychiatrists permission to speak to each other about, you know, what's really going on in mental illness. Could there be a spiritual dimension? When people are hearing voices, could this possibly be some kind of possession. I mean, the kind of question you couldn't possibly ask in a normal psychiatric seminar, but they've given each other permission to come out. And so I think these organizations within professional groups or within labs provide one way of doing it, a club, a society, a special interest group. And I think the more that exists, the better, because people will find that they're not as isolated as they think. And by working together, it may be possible to change things in a way that working separately, it isn't. So I'm quite hopeful about the power for change if people work together.
That's just perfect to end it all. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Rupert, again. And well, see you soon.
Yes, thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Rupert. Thank you, Alex. We look forward to seeing you at our next event, which will be in April on the 12th. Alex will be in conversation with Graham Hancock under talking about the future human. So you can find the link there in the chat, and that is another free event. So just sign up on our website and we will send you the link. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Goodbye. See you soon.